Welcome to Vlogz Automotive Podcast, a hybrid call-in talk show where you, the viewer or listener of the Vlogz YouTube channel, can tune in and listen to the latest in automotive news and happenings within the automotive space. I'm Mario Gear. Want to be a part of the show? It's easy. Just call our show voicemail hotline at 805-419-5129 any time of the day of the week before the following Thursday and leave a message. Or please follow us on the Clubhouse app. Become a member of the Vlogz Gearheads Club on Clubhouse and raise your hand to come on stage and be a part of the community when we go live, most nights starting at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. So sit back, relax, and crack open a cold one. Car industry woes show how global conflict will reshape trade. The war in Ukraine has highlighted the risk of doing business with authoritarian countries, not just Russia, but also China. The auto assembly lines going quiet in Germany, Britain, and Austria are more than just another example of how fragile supply chains have become. The shutdown may foreshadow a fundamental reordering of the global economy that Russia's invasion of Ukraine will accelerate. The conflict has underlined the risk of doing business in authoritarian countries, not just Russia, but also China, raising the question about the growing dependence of automobile industries on the Chinese market. China's support for Russia has further strained relations between Beijing and the United States and Europe, which were already at loggerheads over trade. In Berlin, the conflict has strengthened members of the new coalition government who argue that Europe, especially Germany and its car industry, has become overly dependent on trade with China. The automakers, with their global reach, complex supply chains, and millions of employees, are a prime example of how the war in Ukraine could reshape international commerce. The war will force all companies to reckon with their exposure to an increasingly hostile political climate. And let's say, after trade wars and the pandemic exposure to the acute vulnerability of global supply chains, the conflict will add to the pressure that corporations now face to manufacture closer to home and reduce the risk that turmoil in a faraway place will throw their operations into chaos. Long-term implications of this war are that we will see a faster deglobalization and a more fundamental move away from the above all German doctrine that economic interests often stand above foreign or security policy interests. Christian Brzezinski, an economist at the Dutch bank ING, said in an email. As a consequence, China could become less important as an export market for European car makers. China has become the world's largest and fastest growing car market and is a critical source of profit for most large automakers and suppliers, including U.S. companies like General Motors and Tesla. Volkswagen sells more than half of the cars it makes in China, and the country accounts for about 1/3 of sales for BMW and Mercedes-Benz. China has also become a crucial source of refined lithium required for electric car batteries, as well as a major manufacturer of the batteries. German automakers once viewed Russia as a promising growth market too, a member of the vaulted BRIC countries, which also includes Brazil, India, and China. But more than 3 decades after the end of the Cold War opened up the market, Russia accounts for less than 2% of the German car maker sales. The other two BRIC countries, Brazil and India, also never quite lived up to the lofty growth expectations of Western automakers. German automakers all but abandoned Russia days after President Vladimir Putin sent his tanks into Ukraine. They had little to lose in a market that is headed towards a deep recession that will surely decimate new car sales in the country for months or years. Volkswagen halted production at its 2 facilities in Russia and suspended exports of all vehicles in the country indefinitely, citing the extensive interruption of business activities. Mercedes-Benz and BMW took similar steps, announcing that they will halt manufacturing in Russia, which was already limited in exports to the country. The biggest foreign car maker in Russia is the Renault-Nissan-Mitsubishi Alliance, which sold more than 500,000 vehicles there last year in a joint venture with the Russian car maker Vantovaz. Renault, who shares fell 17% last week, did not respond to requests for comment on Friday on its plans for Russia. The most immediate problem facing European car makers is how they return production to normal after the Russia invasion cut off supplies of wiring systems made in western Ukraine. Supply chains were already severely strained by shortages of semiconductors and other parts. Ukraine had become a popular place for manufacture the systems which connect electronic components like taillights or entertainment systems inside cars. Assembly is done largely by hand, requiring a large number of skilled workers. Ukraine was attractive because labor is relatively cheap and the workforce well educated. Ukraine is also close to European car factories. Western Ukraine, where automotive suppliers like Leoni have operations, is a 12-hour drive from BMW's factories in Bavaria. One unsettling lesson from the war is that the countries that seemed safe for years ago may not be anymore. Usually, Ukraine would have been considered a relatively stable investment location, a healthy democracy open to foreign investment, said Peter Wells, director of the Center for Automotive Industry Research at Cardiff University in Wales. When fighting halted production at Ukraine's auto suppliers, the effect was almost immediate. No car can operate without wiring systems, which is often tailor-made to specific vehicles. So-called wiring harnesses are among the first components to be installed in new vehicles, and their absence brings assembly lines to a standstill. Within days after Russia's troops crossing into the Ukraine, BMW shut several factories in Germany, Austria, and Britain because of parts shortages. Volkswagen suspended production at multiple locations, including its main German plant in Wolfsburg and a factory in Zwickau that produces electric vehicles, including the ID4 SUVs, which are exported to the United States. Porsche, a unit of Volkswagen, idled a factory in Leipzig that makes Cayenne sports utility vehicles. Mercedes-Benz said it had adjusted shifts at some locations, but all its factories were running. War and sanctions could soon crimp supplies of raw materials from Russia that car makers need. A German association of the automotive industry warned those include palladium used for anti-pollution equipment in cars and nickel essential for car batteries. Ukraine is a major source of neon, a gas used for high-performance lasers that in turn are required for production of scarce semiconductors. And when they're talking about palladium, they're talking about catalytic inverter, folks. Let's see. The fighting has also interfered with air flight, as well as rail traffic on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which German car makers use to supply factories in China. Eventually, automakers will figure out ways to cope. They have lots of recent practice dealing with logistic chaos because of the vid. Switching to alternative sources of wiring systems in other countries that produce them, like Tunisia, will take 2 to 4 weeks, said Joachim Demeski, a managing director at the German Auto Industry Association and an expert on production. The much bigger worry for many European companies, not just car makers, is whether the war in Ukraine will have a chilling effect on international trade. If so, the consequences for Europe could be severe. Exchange of goods and services across borders accounts for 86% of the gross domestic product of the European Union, compared to only 23% of the U.S. economy, according to World Bank figures. A lot depends on what China does, said Guntram Wolf, director of Bruegel, a research organization in Brussels. China is expected to buy more Russia oil and coal if NATO members impose an embargo. Russian oil sales have already slowed sharply because many refiners, shippers, and other companies are shunning the country. Chinese automakers will probably move into the vacuum left in the Russian auto market by the Germans. But Mr. Wolf questions how far China will want to follow Mr. Putin into a prolonged confrontation with the United States and Europe. China is very intertwined economically with the West, he said. I don't know how far China can really go in giving indiscriminate support to Russia. For German automakers and for some U.S. companies like GM and Tesla that have a lot invested in China, the question is almost existential. Whatever. So far, none show any signs of pulling back from China. They are still hoping that the market forces, non-geopolitical, will determine their fate. In the end, said Mr. Demensky of German Auto Association, the customer will decide. Yeah, what do you guys think about this whole kerfuffle with Russia and Ukraine? You think it's going to be a good thing or bad thing for the U.S. economy? Do you think it's could be poised or position ourselves to strengthen manufacturing here in the U.S. on a global scale? Comment down below. Here are some videos YouTube thinks you might like. The next segment clip will be up shortly. Be sure to hit that subscribe, like, comment, and share buttons for this episode. Thanks for hanging out, and I'll see you soon.